As more people had broadband connections, we got to a point of having multiplayer games online. Now, in the tabletop world, multiplayer means more than two players and usually more than two sides. In the video game world, it means more than two players, but it's usually two sides, like as in Team Fortress. In video, the multiplayer first became big with MMOs, but it has now entered the era of team games and games like Call of Duty and so on that you can play online. Now, what happened there was somebody can play these MMOs or these team games or these online multiplayer games for months or even years, so the player doesn't buy a lot of games. You've got human opposition, and so you don't beat the game. This was not good for the game industry because people bought fewer games. And of course, even with human opposition, you could lose a session of a team game, but you didn't really lose altogether. You, in effect, didn't win as much as the other side if they won the battle, but you still improved your character and improved your loot and so on. As generations passed, video games became easier to play and more attractive in order to be playable by normal people as opposed to video gamers. And we have the rise of casual games such as Bejeweled, or we can go back all the way to Tetris as a casual game. Games evolved away from requiring good physical skills, such as quickness and hand-eye coordination, because not everybody has that, and even people who do have the quickness and hand-eye coordination don't necessarily want to employ it when they play a game. So, gradually MMOs and other video games were made more accessible to normal people. Even the AAA console games had to do this because games were getting more expensive to make, so they had to sell millions. And the games were dumbed down. Now, in amongst this, as games became more elaborate, we had games that emphasized story. Now, Japanese role-playing games, computer role-playing games, traditionally emphasize story. In fact, the gameplay in some of the Final Fantasy games tends to be quite a repetitive grind between bits of story. But in the era of 3D, games can appear to be more like movies, and many games become much more cinematic, where the story is the center of the attraction. Now, if the story is the center of the attraction, then the gameplay has to be easy, and you can't lose because you're there to enjoy the story. Now, it's still true that for most games, the story helps sell the game, but it's the gameplay that keeps people playing. But the gameplay can't be too hard or people will quit. Now, hardcore gamers are appalled by the idea that people would quit, but in fact it's quite common, especially amongst normal people. Stories tend to be more passive than active from the point of view of the person who is watching or participating in the story. And so many video games have evolved toward cases where the player is not as active, the player is more passive and watches the story. Even though there's a limitation with stories that once you know the story, there's no reason to play again, but video game companies have got around that by providing different avatars, different characters for people to play, so that each character has different capabilities and encounters the story in different ways. Then we have the rise of free-to-play games. Now, these are often online games, and they need to be really easy and attractive to play, because the idea is to get people to play long enough that they will finally spend some real money on either cosmetic or functional advantages. Cosmetic advantages are ones that just affect looks and don't affect what you can do to play the game. The functional advantages give you an advantage in the game. At some point then, with free-to-play games, the game designer becomes a revenue designer, figuring out how to persuade people to pay their money for something within the game. One of the ways of doing this is to introduce pain points, where the player will spend money to continue because it's painful not to continue. A simple example often used in Zynga games was you need energy to do something and it's slow to recover. So you can use up your energy and then wait hours or until the next day to play some more, or you can pay some real money to buy more energy and continue on right then. So cannot lose in these cases goes to extremes, and the game often tells the player exactly what to do. And players of these games have developed a very low tolerance for frustration. If the player fails, even temporarily, he blames the game, not himself. And he quits. And if he quits, there's no revenue. Or if she quits, there's no revenue. And this ties into social network games. I've also already mentioned Zynga. I do not call them social games, though most people do, because in practice they tend to be solitary, and you're not playing with your friends, you're using your friends to gain advantages in the game. That's not a social game. Social game is a tabletop game where you have several people around a table and they're playing a game with one another. But unfortunately, as often happens, terms are corrupted. It should be called social network games because they're played across social networks like Facebook. As they evolved on Facebook, especially with Zynga, they became very, very simple puzzles that often told the player what to do next. But they had vast number of players, and if only a couple % of those players spent money, then the publisher of the game could make a lot of money, and Zynga did that for a while until people got tired of the very, very simple puzzles. We also now have the rise of mobile games as smartphones and tablets become very common and have sufficient computing power and sufficient screen resolution for the play of casual games. You're not going to have a AAA game on an iPhone or even a tablet, but you can have simple games that are short session games, and that's what many casual games are. In some sense they're time killers, but Killing Time is the killer app for mobile, according to Jacob Nielsen. And Nielsen is the guru of web usability, but much of what he says applies to game design as well. So these games are limited by the power and the screen size of phones. Again, they're not going to be AAA games, but players expect something casual, so it's not a problem. And these games also are often free to play because people are conditioned on mobile platforms to spend very little money on applications, 99 cents, $1.99, $2.99, something like that. On the other hand, if you sell enough like Angry Birds, you can make one heck of a lot of money. So modern younger players are different, and how you design games has changed over time. The younger generation often plays video games with a cheat sheet and internet connection at hand, so if they run into a problem, rather than figuring it out, they look up the solution. And of course, many games more or less tell you what to do. This isn't bad, it's just different. It implies that the players are just as interested in what happens as in making it happen. And that comes back to games being more like movies, more cinematic than they used to be. In earlier video game generations, players were interested in making things happen. And what happened wasn't really very interesting. But with 3D games and computing power today, what happens can be much like a movie. So the result is that video games, with many exceptions of course, have evolved from their roots in tabletop games. In tabletop games, you had to earn something. They were consequence-based. If you screwed up, you lost the game. And early video games were like that. Think of arcade games. But now games are more or less reward fests, where players are rewarded for everything they do. They're based on participation. They have de-emphasized physical skills without particularly requiring mental skills, and no failure is possible. And free-to-play and MMOs have had a lot to do with that. So, games have changed a great deal. And game designers have to recognize that and cope with it. And of course, games are much shorter as well, which may be a consequence of shortened attention spans, because modern people are bombarded with so many things, so many ways to spend their leisure time, so many distractions. In game design, if you're aiming for a broad market, it's very different from what it used to be. There are still fans of the older style games, but they are heavily outnumbered. And in the commercial world, the objective of game design is to make money.